storm. But again, this is showing us that it's very active all throughout the Ohio Valley region, down south as well. And so we'll be kind of tracking what's unfolding in these spots like Kentucky and then to the Gulf Coast state, where we are continuing to see the active cycle in not only the severe storms, but the flooding risk that could ensue over the next several days. So we'll have more on the south rain and what we could see over the next several days. Now, let's jump into that because it's the environment where areas like Kentucky, where we have that outlier of the tornado warning as of right now, that is going to fall apart tonight and tomorrow improving conditions. But what we look down south is that after today's dynamic storms, where we were just talking about in the RGV, the Rio Grande Valley, South Texas, through Hill Country, they're going to see this yet again tomorrow. And the reason why is because the environment is very warm, and also you have plenty of moisture that's coming in off of the Gulf. So what ends up happening is you have refueling of the atmosphere, and that leads to that flooding risk for those areas. And so what we'll notice as we time it out for tomorrow is that this low that is parked over the Panhandle region, it's going to slide a little bit towards the east. And by Thursday, what that's going to do is create a long fetch off of the northern Gulf. Not only is it the low, counterclockwise rotation, but we have a high pressure that's parked over the Atlantic, clockwise rotation, and it just keeps pulling that moisture from the Gulf up into the I-10 corridor and even towards I-20, Shreveport, Bossier, kick it out towards Dallas. One key spot to watch is going to be Houston. That comes in tomorrow morning. If you have time to wake up with Fox Weather First, they'll be timing it as that powerful wave comes in. Then on Fox Weather Command, you'll notice as it comes into the Toledo Bend area and continues on. But these areas are waterlogged, and by this point, you're looking at how much more rain can they actually take on. We'll time that out for you, but let's talk more about the East Coast and all the rain that they will see over the next several days and what it translates to areas like Bat Cave, North Carolina, where you're seeing this is one that stood out, of course, during Hurricane Helene, which forever changed the topography and terrain, the scars, and why when you look at rain events in western North Carolina in the higher elevation, it can lead to raging rivers and very close to the road itself. It makes it uncomfortable at times for these spots. Now, these are drought-ridden areas, so another component into that is when you're in an extended drought, the ground, even the soil itself, becomes so compacted and hardened that the rain that comes in immediately washes away. And it leads to those visuals we just showed it to you. So there's that high pressure that I was talking about that's parked over the Atlantic. There's that low, and here's the funnel, right? That's in between. Remember, high is clockwise rotation. So you're creating this fetch over the western Atlantic, the northern Caribbean, and the Gulf. And with all of that, you're going to have so much available rain and water, I should say, water in the atmosphere, that once it translates into rain, you start to see it to that excessive rain rate, where you're now looking at flash flooding becoming widespread. So this is the flood watch that's in place through tomorrow from New Orleans all the way to Atlanta and anywhere in between. By the way, these are areas that have already seen 6, 7, 8 inches of rain since last Friday. And so there's nowhere for that additional rain to go. So this is today's threat. We were just tracking it out. And then tomorrow's threat spills to the I-95 corridor, does include the nation's capital and down towards Richmond, areas on the other side of the Appalachian Range through the Ohio Valley region. That's where you could have that flooding risk, Cincinnati out towards Columbus. Here's a broad view of it all. Notice overnight tonight, Kentucky's event dissolves. We have rain, cool atmosphere in the mid-Atlantic, and then it warms back up into the 80s. And tomorrow afternoon, more storms. Let's take you down now into Florida, where you're looking at this water spout that played out over the weekend. And water spouts usually are quick. They're not as powerful, and they could sometimes dissipate before they move on land. This one did not. And look at what unfolded at the beach there. From this vantage point, you have the security of your hotel. It looks, chaotic, but you're seeing all the debris that's getting thrown around, the umbrellas that are getting ripped out of the sand and thrown hundreds of feet. And from this vantage point, it may not seem that alarming. I can tell you, though, sadly, coming into the Fox Weather Forecast Center today, there was someone who died in South Carolina that was impaled by an umbrella over the weekend. And that happens during a very powerful wind event. Now, you can talk about how the odds of that happening has got to be like almost nearly impossible. but why it's so important when we're talking about active weather and moving into the summer season to know how volatile this environment can be in a matter of moments, right? When you're talking about the heat that's bottled up down south, 80s and 90s. Then you have the dew points or the humidity that's more into the 60 and 70 percentile, which allows those thunderstorms 30, 40 minutes or less. And what can turn into a beautiful family vacation and moment into something terrifying real quickly. I'm not saying every time you go to the beach, something bad like that's going to happen, but why it's important at times to know that when you're on vacation mode, to not disregard the weather, right? I do want you to be able to relax. I want you to have that moment where you can kind of block all the noise out. But if there are storms that are setting up, you have the Fox Weather app, right? You have the notifications turned on. We can get you those alerts. But I will also tell you now, before you get deep into the summertime, maybe you have some vacation plans. Wherever you're going, anywhere around the globe, especially stateside, you can plug it into our app. And we will get you that updated forecast. And then day up, as you're on that vacation, you can time it out on radar. We will build that awareness for you to make sure it's the best vacation possible, and hopefully you can get out of it without having to worry about a story like this, where the weather ruined it, of course. Let's talk more about May. It's typically the peak of tornado season, but this year, the atmosphere has been surprisingly unfavorable in some of the most typical tornado alley spots. We'll have more on that and how the season's been shaping up so far when Fox Weather Live returns. Stay with us.
I've got something to tell you. I have cancer.
For the live, we are in the severe season. We're going to talk a little bit more now about what tomorrow's threat is going to be like as it emerges. You'll notice a few tornadoes, damaging wind gusts possible in the bluegrass state, Lexington down towards Bowling Green. And so we'll be watching some of those major interstates like I-65, I-75 as we progress towards the evening time. Then we look at I-95, the nation's capital, Richmond, even out towards I-81, the eastern foothills of the Appalachian Range. Now, yes, you're going to have each storm that could pose a threat, whether it's that damaging wind, tornadic risk, or maybe even some hail, but it's also the amount of rain that is possible in these areas like, kind of towards Cincinnati, Columbus, and on the western side of the Appalachian Range. It's the frequency at which these storms have been coming in at and the amount of rain. So broad view showing you when it's going to all unfold overnight tonight. It truly does fall apart by tomorrow morning. Now you're starting to watch it kind of brew and build. There's going to be plenty of daylight ahead of time. Then we get into 3 p.m., and now you're noticing those thunderstorms that are starting to build into those multiple locations. The more that daytime heating, the more instability, and then we move overnight and it falls apart. A lot of that moves offshore by Thursday. Notice another spot that does remain active, though, into Texas. Down south, their atmosphere refuels itself time and time again because of how close it is to the Gulf. But using D.C. as an example, tomorrow afternoon is when we expect those thunderstorms and then clearing. Notice that temperatures will still climb into the 80s. It will be warm not only tomorrow, but as we move through Thursday and Friday. So we'll be timing it out and watching how it all evolves as we get into the severe season. But truly, we know that the severe season has been a little bit different, evolving. I want to bring in Kiana as we kind of unpack the key to that, because we're talking about D.C. tomorrow, yet there's a major state that we haven't really talked much about this last month.
Oh, yeah, the Sooner State actually has not seen any tornado reports in the month of May. 0.
Wow.
And typically, they do have, the month of May, they have about, on average, 33 tornadoes. So that just goes to show how this year, in this severe weather season, has definitely been a little wacky, especially if you consider the states that are designated under Tornado Alley. We're talking Texas, Oklahoma, and areas like Kansas. Well, as I mentioned, Oklahoma is one of those states where you look at the map, all of the tornado reports for the month of May, it is completely blank. We haven't seen any tornado reports out of Oklahoma. Now, bear in mind, this is some good news because we did have our fair share of some severe weather in Oklahoma. We look at the month of May, and usually May outnumbers April. That just was not the case. As I mentioned, 33 on average. We have some other states that typically don't even see tornado or tornadic activity. California now topping Oklahoma when we look at the total reports. We have at least one report there so far, and that was from a land spout that came on shore in the northern half of the state. So that wasn't a true tornado through and through, but it did have that rotational leverage and made its way on shore. Now, as I mentioned, we did have our fair share of some active weather in the month of May for Oklahoma. So that is not being negated. But when it comes to how strong some of these storms were and the reason why we haven't yet seen any tornado reports out of Oklahoma, a lot of it has to do with the storms being capped. Remember, it's that layer of warm, stable air that actually limits explosive growth when it comes to storms. And we haven't seen that kind of play out for the state of Oklahoma. A lot of our storms have been limited by that layer, and thus we haven't had strong tornadic storms. Here's a look back over May for Oklahoma. We definitely have had several days and several weeks where we've seen severe weather. Thankfully, and fingers crossed, we don't see it for the remainder of this month, but we haven't had a level 4 or level 5. We have had a level 3 and several level 2, so we did have the instability in the atmosphere, but a lot of those storms were capped, unfortunately. Now, let's say we go through the rest of this week, we don't see any more tornadoes or at least tornado reports in Oklahoma. This will be the first time that we go tornado-free in Oklahoma since 2005. So over 20 years, we're going to see this stretch. You know, each and every year we definitely have had our fair share, but this year may resemble more like 2025. And Steve, my hope is for the sake of Oklahoma and for the sake of safety, that is the case.
Yeah, it looks like it. We have an Omega pattern that's setting up, so it's keeping them relatively quiet, Kiana. So we're going to dive into, because the other factor of the Omega is the heat that's bottled up. And so we'll take you into places like the northern plains and into the upper Midwest, where temperatures 20 to 30 degrees above average already. Record highs been broken. Spots like Bismarck, North Dakota, got to 96 degrees today. Think about that. North Dakota getting into the mid-90s. So here's that Omega pattern. And this is where Kiana was talking about. There's the state of Oklahoma. If the jet stream is that far to the north, forced to the north underneath that ridge, they will stay relatively quiet. It's going to be areas south of there along the Gulf where you're going to get that activity. But let's talk about the northern tier. Here's those temperatures. Bismarck is not alone. We're talking about multiple states, whether it's Big Sky Country, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin, even up towards the Ute, that are seeing those records that are broken and the temperatures that are more indicative of the very heart of summer. And you're looking at 20 to 30 degrees above average. You get into Thursday, Billings, Montana, into the lower 90s. Here in a moment, we're going to talk about the other side of this, where some of the high terrain could actually be getting some snow. That high terrain is not in Montana. Montana's on the opposite end of this extreme. They're talking about the intense heat that continues to boil in these spots. That's another thing to look at, is not only the peak of the event, right, the hottest part of it, but the longevity of it. We're looking at a heat wave that could be formed with 3 days in a row, 20 to 30 degrees above average for these spots like Bismarck, where they're into the mid-90s. We look into Minneapolis, their temperatures, they're climbing into the 90s as well. I know Ian Leonard, he's going to be joining our Ian tomorrow in the afternoon to talk more about their chaotic roller coaster of a season so far and what they can expect in the days ahead. And you'll notice overall the broad outlook is showing you expect some warm. Now, that's for areas in the northern tier. Let's talk about on the other end of the Omega pattern, where you actually have the big dip in the jet stream, and that allows a little bit of action for these spots like Soda Springs, California, where they're looking at actually kind of this wintry mix right now. Temperature's 35, but it feels like it's below freezing. So when it hits the surface, it's really struggling right now to stick. But then you get to other areas, absolute gem and wonder of our country, Yosemite National Park, Half Dome, hidden behind the clouds right now. But what's the opportunity of the Central Sierra getting some snow? Let's talk more about that, because here's that big dip in the jet stream. That's what's going to allow that cold air. And we're in the high terrain. Maybe you could pick up a foot of snow. That's going to be near the crest. Not where many people live, of course. As of right now, Broadview just kind of shows you that instability. It's spots like Mammoth Lakes. That's where you could start to get some of that, upslope, some of the snow that continues in Mammoth Lakes down towards Three Rivers. This is going to be confined to the Central Sierra up towards Lake Tahoe. That's at 6,500 feet. Vastly different what happens at 6,500 feet versus 12,000 feet. So Lake Tahoe, it looks like you're going to get that wintry mix at best. Kind of a cold sleet. It will melt on contact to most locations. Into the Tahoe Basin, that's just south of there, maybe Kirkwood, they could get about 8 to 12 inches of snow. Mammoth Lakes, again, if you live in these areas, you get out those old skis, not the good ones, right? The old ones. Maybe you get out there, do a little backcountry skiing, do some cross-country skiing. The reason why I mention that is because you're going to have some exposed rock, right? And so you're going to be taking some chips out of the old skis once you get out over the next several days, but a good opportunity to cash in on some late season snow. Now, how late in the season is the snow? Well, it's almost getting all the way into the tropical season. That's how late we are. And so let's get into the countdown that is on for the Atlantic hurricane season as we look at we're less than a week away. And the Gulf is already showing signs of potential life for some homegrown system. Remember, this is a long-range, broad outlook on what we could be seeing. So 6 days away, we get into what we could see early on. What we're going to have is a stationary boundary. You're going to have rising air thunderstorms. If it stays there for long enough, maybe that develops a low. So regardless of if this low develops, regardless of if it gets named at all, whatever is designated is going to bring widespread rain to the Gulf Coast region. By the way, this is the same area that we just talked about at the top of the show that's going to have multiple days of rain. So looking at this as beneficial in one aspect, hopefully helping out with the drought, but also could be on the heels of a very wet week, which could elevate that flooding concern. Let's look into this. This is June 4th, right? So we're looking at over a week away, roughly 10 days, and you got this low pressure that forms in the western and central Gulf. But here's the thing, the environment, the atmosphere itself, is not conducive to building thunderstorms. Because you have this harsh vertical wind environment that kind of shreds it apart. So you're going to have rising air. You're going to have plenty of moisture, of course. You're in the Gulf. But will it actually start to spin up and form something? What you'll notice right now, water temperature is quite warm. So at times, when the temperature is warm enough, it can be bullish and it can lean into those winds and, allow those thunderstorms to continue to become more widespread. By the way, in the entire Gulf, the maximum water temperature encroaching into the lower 90s. All right, we're going to be keeping you up to date with weather all across the globe. So let's take you now down into Chile. They actually had a magnitude 6.9 earthquake that rattled the northern part just yesterday. You can also see the metal structures a little more rocking than you'd find comfortable. And here's another vantage point of that during the actual earthquake itself, showing you what these countries in South America were dealing with. We're going to be having more on international stories, of course, as the summer travel season gets underway and Fox Weather Live returns. Stay with us.